My neighbor's kid started doing homework at my kitchen table every day, and now his parents think I'm trying to steal him. The first time Caleb showed up at my door with his backpack, I thought he'd knocked on the wrong house. He was maybe 10 years old, skinny with dark hair that stuck up in the back, wearing a shirt with a stain on the collar. He asked if I had Wi-Fi he could use for homework, because his internet was down again. I'm a 38-year-old software engineer who works from home, so my setup is solid. I figured helping a kid with homework was the neighborly thing to do. I let him sit at my kitchen table and gave him the password. He spread out his math worksheets and worked quietly for an hour before thanking me and heading back to the house next door. I didn't think much of it until he showed up again the next day. Then, the day after that. By the end of the first week, Caleb was arriving every afternoon at 3:30 with his backpack and staying until dinner time. I started keeping snacks around because he always looked hungry. My wife left me 8 months ago, so the house feels too big and too quiet most days. Having Caleb around doing homework at the table while I worked on my laptop in the living room made the place feel less empty. He was a good kid, polite, and focused on his schoolwork. He never asked for food directly, but I noticed him staring at the pantry when I went to grab something. I started offering him granola bars and apple slices, which he'd accept with this grateful look that made my chest feel tight. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into this routine, I asked him why he couldn't do homework at his own house. Caleb kept his eyes on his worksheet and said his parents fought a lot and it was too loud to concentrate. He said his dad got angry when he asked questions about homework, and his mom was usually too tired to help because she worked 2 jobs. He said my house was quiet and I didn't yell at him when he got math problems wrong. I'd seen Caleb's parents a few times since they'd moved in 6 months ago. His father, Marcus, was a large man with a voice that carried through walls, especially when he was angry. I'd heard him shouting at Caleb more than once through the open windows in summer. His mother, Denise, seemed exhausted whenever I saw her, always rushing to or from her car with her work uniform on. They'd never introduced themselves beyond a brief wave when they first moved in. I kept my distance from neighbors generally because I preferred peace and quiet, but Caleb had somehow slipped past my boundaries without me noticing. By week 4, he was showing up with more than just homework. He'd bring books from the library and read at my table for hours. He'd ask me questions about my work and listen intently when I explained coding concepts. He started calling me Mr. Foster instead of Sir, which felt oddly formal and endearing at the same time. The arrangement worked fine until Caleb's mother showed up at my door one evening around 6 AC. I'd just finished helping Caleb with a science project about the solar system. Denise was still in her nursing scrubs, her face tight with exhaustion, and something else I couldn't identify. She asked if Caleb was there, and I said yes, explaining that he'd been coming over to do homework because their internet was spotty. Denise's expression shifted to something harder. She said Caleb needed to come home immediately and that he shouldn't be bothering me every day. Caleb gathered his things with his head down, not looking at either of us. As they walked back to their house, I heard Denise scolding him about imposing on neighbors and wasting time when he should be helping around the house. I stood in my doorway feeling confused and slightly guilty, though I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong. Caleb didn't come over the next day, or the day after that. I told myself it was better this way, that I'd been getting too attached to a kid who wasn't mine, and it wasn't healthy for either of us, but the house felt even emptier than before. On the 3rd day, I heard Marcus shouting next door around the time Caleb usually came over. I couldn't make out the words, but the anger in his voice was clear. 20 minutes later, there was a quiet knock on my back door. Caleb was standing there with his backpack, his eyes red from crying. He asked if he could please just do homework for 1 hour and promised he'd leave right away after. I let him in without hesitating. He sat at the kitchen table and pulled out his books, but his hands were shaking. I made him a sandwich and he ate it in 3 bites, confirming my suspicion that he wasn't getting enough food at home. I asked Caleb directly if everything was okay at his house. He nodded but wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked if his parents heard him and he shook his head quickly, still not looking at me. He said his dad just got loud sometimes and his mom was stressed about money. He said it wasn't a big deal and lots of kids had it worse. The way he said it, mature and resigned, made me angry at whoever had taught a 10-year-old to minimize his own pain. I told Caleb he could come over whenever he needed a quiet place to work, but that we needed to be honest with his parents about it. He looked terrified at that suggestion. He said his mom already thought he was causing problems, and his dad would be furious if he knew Caleb was complaining about them to neighbors. I dropped the subject, but made a mental note to pay closer attention to what was happening next door. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb came over almost every day, always through the back door to avoid being seen from his house. He'd stay for 2 or 3 hours, doing homework and talking to me about school, books, video games, anything except his home life. I noticed he flinched when I moved too quickly near him. I noticed he wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, and his jeans had holes in the knees that weren't the fashionable kind. I noticed he devoured any food I offered, and would sometimes take snacks home in his backpack when he thought I wasn't looking. I started buying extra groceries and leaving them out where he could access them easily. The situation felt increasingly wrong, but I didn't know what to do about it. Caleb wasn't being beaten or starved in any dramatic way that would justify calling authorities. He just seemed neglected and lonely, which wasn't technically illegal. Then Marcus showed up at my front door on a Saturday morning. I was in my pajamas drinking coffee when he pounded hard enough to shake the frame. I opened it to find him standing there, his face red and his body language aggressive. He demanded to know why I was spending so much time with his son. He said Denise had seen Caleb sneaking over to my house through the backyard multiple times. He said it was inappropriate for a grown man to be hanging around a young boy without the parents' knowledge or permission. His words made my stomach drop because I heard the accusation underneath them. He was suggesting I was a predator. I tried to explain that Caleb just came over to use the Wi-Fi for homework, but Marcus cut me off. He said I needed to stay away from his kid, or there would be consequences. He said if he caught Caleb at my house again, he'd call the police and report me. I spent the rest of that day feeling sick and angry. I'd been trying to help a kid who clearly needed support, and now I was being painted as some kind of threat. I understood Marcus's concern from a parent's perspective. A stranger spending unsupervised time with your child would raise red flags. But the way he delivered the message, with threats and implications, made it clear he wasn't interested in understanding the situation. He just wanted to exert control. That afternoon, I heard shouting next door. Marcus's voice bellowing at Caleb about lying and sneaking around. I heard a crash that sounded like furniture being thrown. Then silence. I stood at my back window staring at their house, my hands clenched into fists, feeling completely powerless. Caleb didn't come over that day or the next. I told myself to let it go, to respect Marcus's wishes even if I disagreed with how he'd communicated them. On the third day, Caleb appeared at my back door during the late afternoon. His left eye was swollen and turning purple. He said he'd fallen down the stairs, but the defensive way he said it made clear that wasn't true. I asked him directly if Marcus had hit him. Caleb's face crumpled and he started crying. He said his dad got really mad about him coming over here and said Caleb was making them look like bad parents. He said Marcus grabbed him hard enough to leave bruises on his arms. He said his mom told him to just stay out of his dad's way when he was angry. Caleb begged me not to say anything because it would just make things worse. He said he just needed a place to be for a few hours where nobody was yelling at him. Every instinct I had was screaming that I needed to report this, but Caleb was looking at me with such desperate fear that I hesitated. I let Caleb stay for a few hours. I gave him an ice pack for his eye and made him dinner. We didn't talk about the bruises or his father. We just sat at the kitchen table and I helped him with his homework while he gradually stopped shaking. Around 7, he said he needed to get home before his dad noticed he was gone. I walked him to the back door and watched him cross through the yards to his house. Then I went back inside and called the child abuse hotline. I gave them my name, address, and detailed information about what I'd observed over the past 2 months. The representative said they'd open an investigation and send someone to check on Caleb within 48 hours. She warned me that the family would likely be told someone reported them, though they wouldn't be given my name initially. I hung up feeling like I'd either saved Caleb or destroyed whatever fragile trust we'd built. The next afternoon, a silver sedan pulled up in front of Caleb's house. A woman in business casual clothing knocked on their door and was let inside. She stayed for about an hour. After she left, I heard Marcus shouting loud enough that I could make out some words through the walls. He was yelling about nosy neighbors and people who didn't mind their own business. He was yelling about how nobody understood how hard it was to raise a difficult kid. The shouting went on for over an hour. I sat in my living room feeling nauseated, knowing I'd made things worse in the short term even if I'd done the right thing. That night around 10 someone threw a rock through my front window. The glass shattered inward, spraying across my living room floor. By the time I got outside, the street was empty. I called the police and filed a report, though I had no proof of who'd done it. The police officer who took my statement was sympathetic but direct. He said property damage was hard to prove without witnesses or security cameras. He asked if I had any disputes with neighbors. I explained the situation with Caleb and the Child Services investigation. The officer's expression changed. He said I needed to be very careful about the optics of an adult man spending time alone with a child who wasn't related to him. He said even though my intentions might be good, it could easily be misinterpreted. He suggested I might want to keep my distance from the family entirely to avoid any accusations. His words felt like a punch to the gut because they reinforced what Marcus had implied. People would assume the worst about me because I was a man showing interest in a child's welfare. The assumption of guilt felt profoundly unfair, but I understood the reality of it. I had my window repaired the next day and installed a security camera system. For a week, I avoided looking at Caleb's house and tried to focus on work. I saw Caleb getting on the school bus in the mornings, but he never looked toward my house. I told myself the Child Services investigation would handle things and I needed to stay out of it. Then on a Friday evening, Denise knocked on my door. She looked exhausted and angry in equal measure. She said the caseworker had closed the investigation after one visit because they determined the home was safe and Caleb's bruises were consistent with normal childhood accidents. She said Marcus was furious about the report and knew it had come from me. She said I needed to understand that I was causing serious problems for their family and making their lives harder. She said Caleb was being punished for the trouble he'd caused by coming over here without permission. I asked Denise directly if she understood that Caleb was coming to my house because he needed peace and support he wasn't getting at home. She bristled at that. She said I didn't know anything about their family or what they were dealing with. She said Marcus worked hard and provided for them, and if he got stressed and yelled sometimes, that was normal. She said I was a stranger with no right to judge their parenting. I asked about Caleb's black eye. Denise said he'd fallen down the stairs, and I was making something out of nothing. She said if I really cared about Caleb's well-being, I'd stop interfering and let them handle their own family matters. She said if I contacted child services again or encouraged Caleb to keep coming over, they'd get a restraining order against me. Then she left. I stood in my doorway, watching her walk back to her house, feeling like I'd failed Caleb completely. That weekend, I barely left my house. I kept watching through my security camera footage, looking for signs of Caleb. I saw him taking out the trash on Saturday morning, moving carefully with his shoulders hunched. I saw Marcus leave for several hours Sunday afternoon. I saw Denise come and go in her work uniform. Everything looked normal from the outside, which was exactly the problem. Abuse that happened behind closed doors was nearly impossible to prove, and caseworkers who did one brief visit couldn't see the pattern of emotional and physical harm that happened over time. I felt trapped between my knowledge that Caleb needed help and the reality that I had no legal standing to provide it. Worse, my attempts to help had apparently made his situation worse. Marcus was likely taking out his anger on Caleb, blaming him for the investigation and the neighbors' interference. On Monday afternoon, I was working from home when I heard a timid knock on my back door. Caleb was there with his backpack, looking smaller and more afraid than I'd ever seen him. His eye had healed to a yellowish bruise. He said he knew he wasn't supposed to come over, but he had a math test tomorrow and couldn't understand the material. He said his dad told him he'd better not fail any more tests or there would be consequences. He said his mom was working a double shift and, couldn't help. He asked if I could please just explain the math concepts to him one time, and then he'd never bother me again. The desperation in his voice broke something in me. I pulled him inside quickly, worried about being seen. We sat at the kitchen table and went through the practice problems together. Caleb was actually quite good at math once the concepts were explained clearly, which made me wonder how often he failed tests, simply because he had no support at home. After we finished the homework, Caleb sat there picking at a loose thread on his backpack. He said quietly that his dad told him I was a bad person who was trying to cause trouble for their family. He said his dad told him that men like me who showed interest in other people's kids were usually dangerous. He said he didn't think I was dangerous, but he was confused about why I was nice to him when his own parents weren't. The question made my chest ache. I told Caleb that some adults found it hard to show love and support, even when they felt it inside. I told him his parents were probably doing their best with whatever tools they had, even if their best wasn't good enough. I told him he deserved kindness and help with homework, and someone who listened when he talked. I told him none of this was his fault. Caleb started crying silently, tears just rolling down his face while he stared at the table. I wanted to hug him and tell him everything would be okay, but I was acutely aware of the accusations that could come from any physical contact. I handed him a box of tissues and let him cry. When he'd composed himself, he asked if I thought his parents would ever change. I wanted to lie and say yes, but I respected him too much for false hope. I said people could change if they wanted to and got proper help, but that change was hard and took time. I said regardless of whether his parents changed, he needed to focus on doing well in school and building a future where he could make his own choices. I said he was smart and capable and deserved a life better than what he had right now. Caleb nodded and wiped his face. He thanked me for helping with the math and for not treating him the way adults usually did. Then he left through the back door, moving quickly to avoid being spotted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Caleb's question about whether his parents would change and my own inadequate answer. The truth was that Marcus and Denise were unlikely to change without serious intervention. Marcus's anger issues and Denise's exhaustion and denial were patterns that had probably existed long before Caleb was born. The system that was supposed to protect kids had already failed Caleb once by closing the investigation too quickly. I had no legal authority, no family connection, and no realistic way to help him beyond letting him do homework at my kitchen table. But even that small thing was now forbidden and dangerous for both of us. I felt the crushing weight of being able to see a child suffering, but being powerless to stop it. The injustice of it made me furious at a system that prioritized parental rights over children's safety. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on my back porch when I heard breaking glass from Caleb's house, then Marcus's voice, louder than usual, shouting about a failed math test. My stomach dropped as I realized Caleb must have done poorly despite our study session. I heard Caleb's voice, small and pleading, trying to explain. Then I heard a loud thump and Caleb crying out in pain. I was on my feet and moving toward their house before I consciously decided to. I pounded on their back door hard enough to hurt my fist. The house went silent. Marcus opened the door, his face red and his expression dangerous. He told me to get off his property. I said I'd heard what sounded like violence and I was checking to make sure Caleb was okay. Marcus said what happened in his house was none of my business. I said child abuse was everyone's business and I would call the police if necessary. Marcus stepped out onto his back porch, closing the door behind him. He was several inches taller than me and had probably 50 pounds of muscle on my frame. He moved into my personal space, clearly trying to intimidate me. He He said I needed to stop harassing his family. He said I was a pathetic man with no family of my own who was obsessed with his son. He said everyone in the neighborhood knew what I was and what I was trying to do. He said if I ever came near his house again or tried to contact Caleb, he'd make sure everyone knew I was a predator. The accusation was crystal clear now, and the threat behind it was obvious. He was going to destroy my reputation if I didn't back off. I held my ground and said I'd already called child services once, and I'd call them again if I had reason to believe Caleb was in danger. Marcus smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He said good luck with that, since they'd already investigated and cleared him. Then he went back inside and locked the door. I walked back to my house shaking with adrenaline and anger. I called child services again and reported the incident I'd heard that morning. The representative said they'd add it to Caleb's file, but since they'd just closed an investigation, it would take significant new evidence to reopen the case. She said repeated reports from the same person could sometimes be viewed as a vendetta rather than legitimate concern. She said if I witnessed actual violence or Caleb showed up with serious injuries, I should call the police immediately rather than going through their system. I hung up feeling more helpless than before. The message was clear. Unless something dramatic and undeniable happened, Caleb was going to continue living in that house with parents who hurt him, and there was nothing I could do about it. The weight of that knowledge sat on my chest for the rest of the day. That evening, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera and saw 2 police officers standing on my porch. My heart started racing as I opened the door. They asked if I was Daniel Foster, and I confirmed. They said they'd received a complaint from neighbors about suspicious behavior involving a minor child. They said Marcus Novak had filed a formal complaint alleging that I'd been luring his son into my home, giving him gifts, and attempting to isolate him from his family. They said these were red flags for grooming behavior, and they needed to ask me some questions. I invited them inside and explained the entire situation from the beginning. I told them about Caleb coming over for homework help, about the neglect I'd observed, about the abuse I'd reported. I showed them my call logs to child services. I showed them my security footage of Caleb coming to my back door, which proved he was initiating contact. The officers listened and took notes. One of them, a younger woman named Officer Reyes, seemed sympathetic. She said it sounded like I'd been trying to help a kid in need. But her partner, an older man named Officer Barnes, was more skeptical. He said good intentions didn't change the optics of an unmarried man spending unsupervised time with a young boy. He said Marcus's concerns weren't unreasonable given how things appeared from the outside. He said even though I had explanations for everything, the pattern of behavior could easily be interpreted as inappropriate. He strongly advised me to cease all contact with Caleb and his family. He said if Marcus filed for a restraining order, it would likely be granted based on the circumstances. He said having that on my record would affect my life in serious ways. The message was clear. Back off or face legal consequences that would brand me as a threat. After the officers left, I sat in my living room feeling completely defeated. I'd tried to help a child who needed it, and the result was that I was being investigated as a potential predator while the actual abuser got to continue hurting his son without consequences. The injustice of it was suffocating. Marcus had successfully weaponized people's fear and suspicion to protect himself and punish me for interfering. And the worst part was that it worked. I had no defense against accusations of inappropriate behavior because proving innocence was nearly impossible. All Marcus had to do was plant the seed of suspicion, and people's imaginations would do the rest. I understood now why so many people chose not to get involved when they saw children suffering. The personal cost was simply too high. The system punished helpers and protected abusers. For the next week, I avoided any contact with Caleb's family. I stayed inside when they were in their yard. I didn't look when the school bus came and went. I tried to convince myself I'd done what I could and now needed to protect myself. But every day, I heard Marcus's voice through the walls, angry and aggressive. Every day, I wondered if Caleb was okay and if he thought I'd abandoned him. The guilt ate at me. I'd promised him a safe place and then taken it away because I was scared of the consequences. I'd prioritized my own reputation over his actual safety. No matter how I tried to rationalize it, I felt like I'd failed someone who had trusted me. The knowledge that failing him was probably the legally and socially correct choice didn't make it feel any less wrong. Then one evening around 9 someone pounded on my back door hard enough to rattle the frame. I looked through the window and saw Caleb standing there in his pajamas, no shoes, his face tear-streaked and panicked. I opened the door and he burst in, talking so fast I could barely understand him. He said his dad had come home drunk and was throwing things. He said his mom was yelling at his dad to calm down. He said something broke and his mom was bleeding. He said he ran out the back door when his dad went to the bathroom. He said he didn't know where else to go. I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. I pulled Caleb inside and locked the door. Through my back window, I could see lights on in his house and movement through the windows. The police sirens stopped on our street. I told Caleb to stay at my kitchen table and went to my front door. 2 police cars were parked in front of Caleb's house with their lights flashing. Officers were going inside. I could hear Marcus's voice, loud and belligerent. I could hear Denise crying. I went back to Caleb and told him the police were at his house. He looked terrified and said he'd get in trouble for running away. I told him he did exactly the right thing by getting to safety. Officer Reyes appeared at my back door about 10 minutes later. She said they'd responded to a domestic disturbance call from a neighbor. She said Marcus was being arrested for assault. She said Denise had a cut on her face from broken glass and was being treated by paramedics. She asked if Caleb was with me. I let her in, and she knelt down to talk to Caleb at his level. She asked if he was hurt, and he shook his head. She asked if his father had hit him tonight, and he said no, that he'd run before anything happened. She said he was very brave for getting himself to safety. Officer Reyes called for a child services caseworker to come to the scene. While we waited, she took my statement about what Caleb had told me when he arrived. She took Caleb's statement about what he'd witnessed at home. She photographed the lack of shoes on his feet and his pajamas, documenting that he'd fled in fear. She said this incident, combined with the previous reports and the arrest, would trigger a mandatory investigation. She said Caleb would likely be placed in emergency foster care while they assessed the safety of the home. Caleb started crying when he heard that. He said he didn't want to go to foster care, that he'd heard bad things about it at school. Officer Reyes told him gently that foster care was meant to keep him safe while adults figured out how to help his family. She said it wasn't permanent and he wasn't being punished. But her reassurances didn't stop Caleb from looking absolutely terrified. A caseworker named Teresa Blackwood arrived about an hour later. She was a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She talked to Caleb for a long time, asking him about his home life, his parents, the incidents I'd reported. Caleb was honest in a way he hadn't been during the previous investigation. He talked about his dad's anger and the hitting. He talked about being hungry. He talked about feeling scared all the time. He talked about coming to my house because it was the only place he felt safe. Teresa took detailed notes and asked Caleb if he wanted to stay with his mom or go to a foster home. Caleb said he wanted to stay with his mom, but not if his dad was there. Teresa said she'd do her best to arrange that. Then she asked Caleb if he wanted to say goodbye to me before she took him. Caleb looked at me with devastated eyes and asked if he'd ever see me again. I didn't know how to answer that. Teresa said it would depend on the investigation and the judge's orders. She said if I'd been cleared of any wrongdoing, supervised visits might be possible eventually, but she also said the priority was keeping Caleb safe and stable, which might mean limiting contact with anyone outside his immediate family. Caleb stood up and walked over to me. He said thank you for helping him with homework and for being nice to him when nobody else was. He said he was sorry he got me in trouble with his parents. He said he hoped I wouldn't be mad at him for causing problems. I knelt down so we were eye level and told him he hadn't caused any problems. I told him the only people who should be sorry were the adults who'd hurt him. I told him to do well in school and remember that he deserved better than what he'd been given. Then Teresa led him out to her car and drove away. I stood in my kitchen feeling empty and angry and relieved all at once. The next morning, a detective called and asked me to come to the police station for an interview. I spent 3 hours answering questions about my relationship with Caleb, about every interaction we'd had, about why I'd let him into my home repeatedly, despite his parents' objections. The detective was professional, but clearly trying to determine if I'd crossed any lines. I explained everything honestly and provided my security footage showing Caleb always initiating contact. I provided my phone records showing my calls to child services. I provided character references from colleagues and friends. The detective said my actions appeared well-intentioned, but had been poorly executed. He said I should have contacted authorities immediately instead of allowing an ongoing, unsupervised relationship with a minor. He said my behavior, while not criminal, had shown poor judgment. He said the investigation would remain open while they determined if any charges were warranted. I left the police station feeling numb. My attempt to help Caleb had resulted in him being removed from his home, his mother injured, his father arrested, and me under investigation for potential crimes I hadn't committed. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's accusations had been lies, but they might still destroy my life because perception mattered more than truth. I went home and tried to work, but couldn't focus. I kept thinking about Caleb in some foster home, scared and alone, probably blaming himself for his family falling apart. I thought about Denise, who'd been working 2 jobs and dealing with an abusive husband, now dealing with her son being taken away. I thought about Marcus, whose anger had finally crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. And I thought about myself, a person who'd tried to do the right thing and ended up making everything worse for everyone involved. 2 weeks passed. The investigation continued. A detective interviewed my neighbors, most of whom had nothing useful to say since I kept to myself. A few mentioned seeing Caleb at my house, but had assumed we were related. The detective interviewed Caleb, who apparently defended me and insisted I'd never been inappropriate. That testimony, combined with the security footage and the documented history of me reporting the abuse, eventually led to the investigation being closed without charges. I received a formal letter stating that while my judgment had been questionable, there was no evidence of criminal behavior. The letter felt like being found guilty of wanting to help while being declared legally innocent. It was a hollow victory that didn't change the fact that my reputation in the neighborhood was permanently damaged. Marcus was charged with domestic assault and child endangerment. He pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for mandatory anger management classes and supervised visitation with Caleb. Denise completed a parenting evaluation that raised concerns about her ability to protect Caleb from Marcus's violence. The court ordered family therapy and random home visits from child services. Caleb was placed with a foster family 20 minutes away, but allowed weekly supervised visits with his mother. Teresa Blackwood called to update me on Caleb's placement and asked if I wanted to send any messages to him. I said yes and gave her a short message about being proud of him and hoping he was doing well in school. Teresa said Caleb had asked about me several times and seemed to miss our homework sessions. She said if things stabilized, she might be able to arrange supervised contact, but it would take time. 3 months after that night when Caleb showed up at my door in his pajamas, I was working from home when my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera and saw Teresa Blackwood standing on my porch with Caleb beside her. My heart jumped as I opened the door. Caleb looked different. He'd grown a few inches and filled out slightly. He was wearing new clothes that fit properly. His hair was neatly cut, but the biggest difference was in his expression. He wasn't hunched over and wary. He stood straight and looked me in the eye. Teresa explained that Caleb's placement was going well and he'd been asking to see me. She said the court had approved supervised visits as long as Caleb wanted them and she was present. She asked if I was willing to have him come over for homework help once a week. I said yes without hesitation. We established a routine. Every Wednesday afternoon, Teresa would bring Caleb over for 2 hours. We'd sit at the kitchen table and work on homework together. Teresa would sit in the living room reading or working on her laptop, always within sight, but giving us space to talk. Caleb told me about his foster family, who he said were nice but strict about rules. He told me about his new school, where he was doing better now that he had quiet time to study. He told me he still saw his mom once a week, and she was doing better since his dad moved out. He said his dad was in anger management classes and kept saying he wanted Caleb to come home, but Caleb didn't want to go back. He said for the first time in his life, he felt safe, and he didn't want to give that up, even though he missed his mom. Over the following months, I watched Caleb slowly transform from a scared, hungry kid into someone with confidence and hope. He started getting good grades consistently. He joined the school robotics club. He made friends who came to his foster home for playdates. He talked about wanting to go to college someday, which was a dream he'd never articulated before. During our weekly sessions, he'd tell me about his week and ask about mine. We'd work through homework problems together. Sometimes we'd just talk about books or movies or what he wanted to be when he grew up. Teresa told me privately that I was one of the few stable, positive male influences in Caleb's life, and these visits were important for his development. She said he'd been through trauma that would take years to fully process, but having consistent support made a significant difference. A year after that night when everything exploded, the court held a hearing to determine Caleb's permanent placement. Marcus had completed his court-ordered programs, but still showed poor judgment in several incidents. Denise had improved significantly and was advocating for Caleb to return home. Caleb was asked what he wanted. He told the judge he wanted to stay with his foster family but have regular visits with his mom. He said he didn't feel safe around his dad yet and didn't want to live in the same house as him. The judge granted Denise increased visitation and ordered continued therapy for the whole family. Marcus was given the option of supervised visits if he completed additional counseling. Caleb would remain in foster care until he was old enough to have more say in his living arrangements. It wasn't the reunion Denise had hoped for, but it was the safest option for Caleb. Teresa called me after the hearing and asked if I wanted to continue the weekly visits since they'd been beneficial. She said Caleb considered me a mentor and a friend, and losing that stability would be hard for him. I agreed, without hesitation. Over the next year, our Wednesday afternoon sessions continued. I watched Caleb grow taller and more confident. I watched him navigate the complicated feelings he had about his parents. I watched him build a life that didn't revolve around fear and survival. He told me once that coming to my house for homework that first day had changed everything for him. He said if I hadn't let him in, he didn't know what would have happened. He said he was grateful I'd been willing to get in trouble to help him. The gratitude in his voice made my chest tight with emotion I couldn't fully express. Eventually, Denise reached out to me through Teresa. She asked if we could meet for coffee to talk. I agreed cautiously. We met at a neutral location with Teresa present. Denise looked different, healthier, and more alert. She started by apologizing for how she'd treated me during the crisis. She said she'd been in denial about how bad things had gotten at home and had lashed out at me for forcing her to confront it. She said leaving Marcus and focusing on her own healing had helped her understand how she'd failed to protect Caleb. She said she was grateful that I'd kept trying to help even when she'd told me to stop. She said Caleb talked about me with respect and affection, and she wanted me to know she no longer saw me as a threat. She asked if I'd be willing to support Caleb's relationship with her, to encourage him to give her a chance to prove she'd changed. I told her I would, as long as Caleb felt safe and comfortable. 2 years after Caleb first knocked on my door asking to use my Wi-Fi, we sat at my kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon. He was 12 now, taller and more sure of himself. He told me his foster parents were starting the process to adopt him officially. He said his mom was supportive of the decision because she knew it was best for him. He said his dad was angry about it, but wasn't in a position to fight it. Caleb said he felt relieved and sad at the same time. He said he wished his real parents could have been the family he needed, but he was grateful for the family he had now. He said he was also grateful for me, for letting him do homework at my table when he desperately needed somewhere safe to be. He said without that, he didn't think anyone would have noticed how bad things were until it was too late. He said I'd given him permission to ask for help by showing him what support looked like. 4 years after everything began, Caleb was in high school and thriving. Our Wednesday sessions had evolved into occasional check-ins when he needed advice or help with difficult assignments. He'd grown into a thoughtful, resilient teenager who was planning to study engineering in college. He'd reconciled with his mother to the extent that was healthy for both of them. His father had mostly disappeared after the adoption was finalized. One afternoon, Caleb stopped by to show me his acceptance letter to a state university with a scholarship that would cover most of his expenses. He said he couldn't have imagined this future back when he was a scared 10-year-old doing homework at my kitchen table. He said he wanted me to know that the risk I'd taken, letting him into my house despite the consequences, had saved his life in ways that went beyond physical safety. He said I'd shown him that adults could be trustworthy, that asking for help wasn't weakness, and that his circumstances didn't define his potential. We stood in my kitchen, and for the first time, I hugged him. This kid who wasn't mine, but who'd changed my life as much as I'd changed his. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.